Right. So my name's Aubrey Yost. I am in the statewide planning unit at the Coastal Commission. And I'll hand it off to Erin to introduce yourself.
My name is Erin Praler, and I manage the Coastal Commission statewide planning unit also. Thanks.
And Brian, if you want to give yourself a quick introduction, that'd be awesome.
Oh, sure. My name is Brian Keaton. I am a manager in the Housing Policy Division of HCD and have been involved in SB 9 up until this point, among other things. So I'll be supporting here kind of in the wings.
Yeah, so Brian will be available for questions after our presentation, which is great. So thanks for joining us, Brian. Erin, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Let's see, can we have the next slide, please? So I'm going to give you a roadmap of what we'll discuss today. First, I'll provide a basic overview of what SB 9 requires local governments to do, and then we'll talk about where SB 9 applies. And we'll show you a resource that we developed to assist local governments figure out where SB 9 applies in the coastal zone portion of their jurisdictions. Next, we'll discuss how SB 9 and the Coastal Act interact and how SB 9 should be applied in the coastal zone, particularly in areas vulnerable to coastal hazards. Then we'll go through some case studies of examples of recently certified LCP amendments that address SB 9. And at the end, we'll have some time for questions. Next slide, please. So let's talk about what SB 9 requires. Next slide. SB 9 became effective last year in January 2022. It added two new laws, Government Code Sections 65852.21 and 66411.7. Together, these laws require local governments to ministerially consider housing developments with no more than two primary units and lot splits that meet certain requirements in single-family zones. Ministerial review means a process for development approval that does not involve any personal judgment by the public official about the wisdom of carrying out the project. This means that a lot in a single family zone that could have previously only supported one residential unit could now support up to 4 residential units if it is subdivided and has 2 residential units developed on each new lot. In addition, development standards that prevent an otherwise eligible lot from being split or prevent the construction of up to 2 units that are at least 800 square feet in size no longer apply or must be modified to allow for the lot split or housing development. To be eligible for SB 9, a proposed lot split or housing development project must meet certain criteria that address environmental site constraints, such as the presence of wetlands and wildfire risk, anti-displacement measures for renters and low-income households, and the protection of historic structures and districts. Next slide, please. Local governments can adopt objective zoning, subdivision, and design review standards for lot splits and development of residential units in any residential zone, as long as these standards do not conflict with the new laws, Government Code Sections 65852.21 and 66411.7. Next slide. The state of California is experiencing a critical shortage of affordable housing. In recognition of this critical shortage, the state legislature has passed numerous laws in recent years aimed at increasing construction of additional housing units, including SB 9. Next slide, please. SB 9 only applies in certain areas. The provisions requiring ministerial consideration of lot splits and development of 1 or 2 housing units only apply in single-family residential zones. In addition, SB 9 only applies to parcels in urban areas. In cities that include any portion of either an urbanized area or urban cluster, all parcels are geographically eligible. In unincorporated areas, parcels that are located entirely within either an urbanized area or urban cluster are eligible. The U.S. Census Bureau defines urbanized areas and urban clusters, and it updates these designations with information from the most recent census. And I'll pass it on to Aubrey.
Thanks, Erin. So I'm going to demonstrate a map viewer that we created for SB9, and then I'll talk about how SB9 applies in the coastal zone and give some examples of recently certified LCP amendments that are implementing SB9. So to help local governments get a sense of where SB9 may apply in their jurisdictions in the coastal zone, Commission staff created a SB9 geographic eligibility map viewer. And this viewer is intended to give users just a general idea of the areas that might meet the basic geographic eligibility requirements of SB9 in the coastal zone. So it doesn't show whether a particular project is eligible for ministerial consideration under SB9, or whether a parcel is located in a single family residence zone. And it also doesn't show if there's any Coastal Act issues like sea level rise vulnerability that are present. And so that information has to be determined based on information submitted by an applicant and local government zoning and LCP requirements. So I'm going to share my screen now, and I will show you this map. So when you first open the map viewer, there'll be a box that you can see here that pops up that describes what the viewer can be used for, and it provides links to other resources like the SB9 legislation and the commission memo on SB9. So you can go ahead and click I understand here when you've read through that. So when you get into the map viewer, in the top left-hand corner, there's a search bar that allows you to find a location by address or a place name. So let's go to Santa Cruz. So here you can see we're in the Santa Cruz area. And in the top right-hand corner, there's two icons here under the public SB9 geographic eligibility banner. So this one on the left that shows three shapes with lines extending out to the right is the legend. So this will tell you what each of these colors and layers represent. So the dark blue line here, this is the coastal zone. So you can see it running all along here. And this map viewer only shows data within the coastal zone. So although it looks like maybe these areas aren't eligible for SB9, we just don't know that from this map viewer because this map viewer only has data for the coastal zone itself. And then you can see here that there's also this yellow shaded area, and this is the areas that are potentially eligible for SB9. So that means that these areas meet the basic geographic eligibility requirements for ministerial consideration that Erin was just talking about. So either they're located in an incorporated city that has a US Census Bureau designated urban area within its borders, or B, the parcel is outside of an incorporated city, but the parcel is located entirely within one of those designated urban areas. So those are kind of the two ways you can be geographically eligible for SB9. And so, like I mentioned earlier, this doesn't show if these areas are zoned for single family use. So although it looks like all of this area, let's see, here is eligible for SB9, you still need to look into the zoning designation. And then the other layer we've got here is this light blue area. And this is a buffer of areas potentially eligible for SB9. And I need to include this because they're the data between the US Census Bureau and the data that incorporated cities have, and parcel data from county assessor's offices doesn't always perfectly align. So sometimes it might look like there's a parcel that is not geographically eligible for SB9, but really it's just those boundaries don't quite align in all those different data sets. So we included this buffer, and it's a 100-meter buffer. So we're kind of guessing that if something should be included, but just is kind of a little bit off from the data, that hopefully should be captured here. So that's the purpose of the blue buffer. And going back to this legend, if you click on the eye icon here, this will give you some more information on SB9, where it applies, and it'll also give you links to some additional instructions here, and to our SB9 guidance memo. So this map viewer is available on the local government's resources page on the California Coastal Commission's website. This page is going to be updated in the next month, so it might look a little bit different, but we'll have the map viewer here. You can see the link right here. And we've also got here the SB9 memo that has more information, and it'll go into greater depth than what we're talking about today. So I'll stop sharing my screen. If we could go to the next slide. Great, thanks. So now that we've talked about what SB9 requires and where it generally applies, let's discuss how it applies in the coastal zone. But first, I'm going to give you a quick introduction to the Coastal Act. So in the coastal zone, development generally requires a coastal development permit, or a CDP. And the coastal zone extends between several hundred feet and up to 5 miles inland along the coast. It varies. And on the seaward side, the coastal zone encompasses the mean high tide line boundary, and it extends up to 3 miles seaward to the state federal boundary of coastal waters. The Coastal Commission and local governments with certified local coastal programs, or LCPs, issue CDPs. LCPs are documents that contain policies that govern development and protection of coastal resources for a specific region, so typically a city or a county. And the commission has to find that a local government's LCP is consistent with the Chapter 3 policies of the Coastal Act to certify an LCP. Once an LCP is adopted by the local jurisdiction and certified by the Coastal Commission, then the permitting authority is transferred to the local jurisdiction, and they will issue CDPs. When the Coastal Commission issues a CDP, it also has to find that the development is consistent with the Chapter 3 policies of the Coastal Act. Next slide, please. The Chapter 3 policies of the Coastal Act protect a variety of coastal resources. So it protects public access to and along the shoreline, public and lower cost visitor serving recreational opportunities like hiking and camping, and productive agricultural lands, rural lands, and maintenance of stable urban rural boundaries. That's mostly done through concentration of development in existing urban areas and avoiding urban sprawl and leapfrog development. Marine resources, and the protection, enhancement, and restoration of environmentally sensitive habitat areas, or ESHA, and many other coastal resource protections. So we'll touch on some of the common coastal resource issues raised by SB9 in just a minute. Next slide, please. Chapter 3 of the Coastal Act also includes hazards policies that require, among other things, that new development has to be sited and designed to minimize risk to life and property in areas of high geologic flood and fire hazard. New development also cannot create or contribute significantly to erosion, geologic instability, or destruction of the site or surrounding area, or require the construction of protective devices that would substantially alter natural landforms along the bluffs and cliffs. And lastly, revetments, seawalls, cliff retaining walls, and other kinds of construction that alter natural shoreline processes have to be permitted when required to serve coastal dependent uses or to protect structures existing at the time the Coastal Act was enacted, or public beaches in danger from erosion. But those need to be designed to eliminate or mitigate adverse impacts on local shoreline sand supply. Next slide, please. All right, so let's talk about how the Coastal Act and SB9 interact. SB9 does not supersede the Coastal Act or certified LCPs. So both new laws that were created by SB9 include what we often call savings clauses for the Coastal Act that say that the new laws do not supersede or in any way alter application of the Coastal Act, except that local governments cannot require public hearings for CDP applications. So that means that currently certified LCPs continue to apply until an LCP amendment incorporating SB9 requirements is adopted. But SB9 and the Coastal Act both apply in the coastal zone, so local governments need to update their LCPs to harmonize the requirements of SB 9 and the coastal protection policies of the Coastal Act. This could be accomplished in a lot of ways, but for example, local governments could update their LCPs to create a checklist of objective standards for qualifying projects so that there's little discretion involved when considering them. And in areas that don't raise any coastal resource or hazard concerns, like some inland built out areas, SB 9 might be able to apply without very many changes to the SB 9 requirements to accommodate that in the coastal zone. But there are other areas that raise coastal resource or hazard issues, and a more nuanced approach might be necessary in those areas. Next slide, please. So this is especially true in areas that are vulnerable to coastal hazards. As described in the Coastal Commission's sea level rise guidance, as sea levels rise, tidal and groundwater inundation, flooding, wave impacts, bluff and beach erosion, saltwater intrusion, and other impacts are projected to worsen and further threaten residential development and coastal resources in the coastal zone. So you can see here pictures of some of the impacts of the storms from January of this year in San Diego and Santa Cruz that damaged homes and infrastructure like roads and prevented people from accessing the beach. So storm and flooding impacts like these are expected to increase over time as sea levels rise. Next slide, please. SB 9 proposals to build 1 or 2 residential units or subdivide have to be consistent with certified LCPs and the Coastal Act to be permitted in the coastal zone. Section 30253 of the Coastal Act is particularly relevant to development in areas vulnerable to sea level rise. I touched on this section earlier, but it requires new development to minimize risks to life and property in areas of geologic and flood hazards, and to new development to assure stability and structural integrity and not create or contribute significantly to erosion, geologic instability, or destruction of the site or surrounding area. And it requires that new development not in any way require the construction of protective devices that would substantially alter natural landforms along bluffs and cliffs. In many cases, increasing density in areas that are subject to sea level rise impacts in the foreseeable future without including appropriate siting, design, and mitigation features would not be consistent with the Coastal Act. And in addition, we like to think about how siting new housing in areas projected to be impacted by sea level rise without planning for adaptation won't address the housing crisis over the long term, and would instead put more residences and lives at risk and can exacerbate housing shortages. Next slide, please. So in addition to the hazards provisions of the Coastal Act, the entire Coastal Act, except provisions requiring local governments to hold public hearings, continue to apply. So there might be other coastal resource issues that arise. Lot split in residential development projects allowed by SB 9 are likely to increase residential density in urban areas, both in terms of the overall number of residential units and in terms of the nature of the built environment itself. So some of the other common coastal resource issues that SB 9 development might raise include impacts to public access and parking, environmentally sensitive habitat areas or ESHA, and visual resources. Next slide, please. So now that we've talked about how SB 9 applies in the coastal zone, let's look at some case studies so you can see examples of how some local governments have harmonized SB 9 and the Coastal Act in their LCPs. Next slide, please. At the March hearing this year, the Commission certified an amendment to the City of Pismo Beach's implementation plan, or their IP, to add SB 9 regulations. So the City of Pismo Beach is mostly urban and built out. And so the vast majority of new residential development that would have been allowed by the city's proposed SB 9 LCP amendment would be considered infill development in areas that generally didn't raise coastal resource issues. But development along parts of the city's bluff shoreline is vulnerable to sea level rise impacts and coastal hazards, like you can see from this picture from the vulnerability assessment. Next slide, please. So the Commission suggested several modifications, which the city was instrumental in coordinating with Commission staff on. And those suggested modifications require that the hazard policies of the city's existing LCP that apply to other kinds of development also apply to SB9 development. So this includes being sited outside of the coastal hazards risk zone for a minimum 100-year period without shoreline armoring, and no armoring being allowed for new SB9 development. This approach ensures that new SB9 development is consistent with the hazard policies of LCP and the Coastal Act. The commission also reduced the parking requirements for SB9 that the city had proposed, except in coastal access areas with constrained parking. So the suggested modifications by the commission mirrored the approach that the city had taken for accessory dwelling units or ADUs, which requires parking on a graduated scale based on unit size. So that they required 1 parking space for studios and 1 bedrooms and 2 parking spaces for 2-bedroom units and larger in areas with constrained parking. So that modification helped protect on-street public parking opportunities and public access while still encouraging needed infill development that's consistent with SB9. And lastly, the commission required a modification to ensure the SB9 development is consistent with all LCP policies, including the requirement to meet wetland, creek, and ESHA setbacks. Next slide, please. At the February hearing this year, the commission certified as submitted the City of Capitola's IP amendment, adding SB9 regulations. So in this LCP amendment, the city proposed to streamline review of SB9 development applications, to have all LCP policies generally continue to apply to SB9 development. And the city also proposed not allowing SB9 development in identified areas within LCP designated and mapped ESHA or geologic hazard areas, or within the mapped 100 and 500-year flood hazard areas. So this ensured that SB9 development wouldn't raise concerns about consistency with the hazards, ESHA, or other policies of the Coastal Act. But it also allowed SB9 applications to proceed outside of these specific designated areas and to be streamlined with a clear map of where SB development was and was not eligible. And lastly, the city proposed to require at least 1 off-street parking for SB9 development in mapped high-volume coastal access areas that already had limited parking. So that LCP amendment was certified as submitted because it really considered the coastal resource impacts of SB9 development in the city. Next slide, please. And then in December of last year, the commission certified the City of Grover Beach's IP amendment to add SB9 regulations. And this was also certified as submitted. For a little bit of context, in Grover Beach, there are no single-family residential areas seaward of Highway 1 or near the city's shoreline or beaches. So any SB9 development would be inland and away from the immediate shoreline. And so it was generally located in areas where denser residential development wouldn't raise coastal resource concerns around coastal hazards and armoring, public access parking or public views, because this area was inland and already largely developed. And other coastal resource concerns, like those relating to ESHA, environmentally sensitive habitat areas, are protected by a policy that states that the coastal resource protections policies of the LCP continue to apply. So Grover Beach is somewhat unique in that development in single-family residential zones in the city is not vulnerable to sea level rise in the near future. And there's no additional requirements relating to hazards beyond the existing LCP policies that were necessary because it was all located pretty far inland. There might be other places along the coast where existing LCP policies in combination with SB9 regulations that streamlined review could be consistent with the Coastal Act without a whole lot of other changes. Next slide, please. So we're getting close to wrapping up, but before we do, I'd like to point out a few SB9 resources that might be helpful for local governments. Like I mentioned before, the Coastal Commission staff issued a memo going into further detail on a lot of the SB9 issues that we've talked about today. And that is available on the resources for local governments page of the Commission's website. And the SB9 geographic eligibility map viewer that we went through is also available on that page of the commission's website. And HCD has a fact sheet that is available on its website on SB9. So I'll send out all these resources in an email after the webinar so that you can easily access them. And if you have questions about how to apply SB9 in a particular jurisdiction in the coastal zone, you can reach out to district staff for that area. Next slide, please. So that concludes the presentation portion, and I'm going to open it up for questions. So please use the icons to raise your hand, or you can type a question in the chat.